The purpose of this lecture is to introduce the colonial origins of the Vietnamese struggle for independence. I'm only going to get through really the content in World War II, and then we'll talk about the post-World War II 1950s part in class tomorrow. So this should be relatively brief. I promised the green class this will be under 10 minutes. We'll see if I can keep my promises. I doubt it, but we'll give it a shot. So the story of Vietnamese colonialism, or colonialism in Vietnam, starts with France. And France takes over Vietnam in 1883 and turns Vietnam into a French colony. This part makes sense if you think about world historical context. This is the exact same time that France and the rest of the European countries are carving up Africa, and really colonialism in Vietnam looks pretty much the same as colonialism in Africa. The French government exploits Vietnamese natural resources and sets up a government run by French colonial officials. Vietnam remains a French colony until World War II. World War II creates a couple of different significant changes in colonial control in Vietnam. The first one is that for a brief time, Japan takes control of Vietnam during the fighting in World War II. France had been in control of Vietnam, but the French government was forced to abdicate when the Nazis took over in France in 1940. Japan then basically swooped in and took control of Vietnam, and that was the case until 1945, when the Allied defeat of Japan forced Japan to leave Vietnam. At that point in time, there was kind of a power vacuum. There was no real power in place. France was trying to regain colonial control, but they still didn't have much of a government. And the indigenous forces of Vietnam that were fighting for independence were able to declare independence for Vietnam in September of 1945. And this Declaration of Independence is significant because Ho Chi Minh, the author of the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence, draws on both the American Declaration of Independence and the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, and uses the arguments from the Enlightenment to justify and defend Vietnamese independence after World War II. So the other piece that I'm going to talk about is resistance to French colonialism and resistance to Japanese colonialism in Vietnam. And this story really, it stems from Ho Chi Minh, who was the communist leader of Vietnam up until his death in 1969. And the story starts with the Paris Peace Conference. In 1919, Ho Chi Minh was in Paris. He was working as a cook. He went by the name Nguyen the Patriot. And he tries to petition Woodrow Wilson at the Paris Peace Conference during the negotiations of the Treaty of Versailles to help have Wilson support a petition for Vietnamese independence from the French. And this would have made sense because Wilson was very much about self-determination. The problem is that Ho Chi Minh is not given a chance to speak, nor were any other nationalist movement groups outside of those in Europe. And Ho Chi Minh, although he will become the leader of Vietnamese independence forces, really this is the first of a couple different chances where he tries to have the U.S. or get the U.S. to help in fighting for Vietnamese independence. His rejection at the Paris Peace Conference encourages him to turn to communism because he feels then, after the Paris Peace Conference, that communism is what he calls the only tool to liberate the oppressed nations. So in 1930, Vietnam forms the Indochinese Communist Party, and this is formed under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh. The 1930 party platform is significant. The number one thing the party platform calls for is independence. They also talk about confiscating banks, plantations, and enterprises from the imperialists, but not from everyone. They talk about waiving unjust taxes, bringing freedom to the masses, universal education, and equality between men and women. The reason I point these out is the primary function of the creation of the Indochinese Communist Party was nationalism, was independence. It was not primarily a vehicle to produce communism or communist revolution in Vietnam. Communism was a mechanism to facilitate the end to imperialism but really there was nothing inherently communist about Ho Chi Minh. And this becomes very significant when we start to talk about communism in Vietnam after 1945. Ho Chi Minh ultimately leads the charge for Vietnamese independence in 1945, and he had an important job during World War II. Ho Chi Minh worked for a U.S. organization called the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS. This was the precursor to the CIA, and they began recruiting Viet Minh leaders. The Viet Minh was the military part of the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, and they recruited Ho Chi Minh to help lead the fight against Japan in Vietnam. And Ho Chi Minh went by the codename OSS Agent 19. He was very helpful in locating downed American fighter pilots in Southeast Asia. And after Vietnam declares independence in 1945, Ho Chi Minh sends 2 different letters to President Truman, the U.S. president at the time, one in November of 45, one in February of 46, and he asks the U.S. for help in supporting Vietnamese independence. Harry Truman responds to neither of these letters, and we're going to see after 1945, 1946 a split or a divergence in thinking between where Vietnam is going on a path to communism and where America is going in an increasingly anti-communist direction at the beginning of the Cold War. So I hope this was short and to the point. I will talk to you again tomorrow.